It's true, we bought land for, well, about $1,000 an acre. Now, part of the truth of that is we bought this property around about 7 years ago, but that's not the reason we were able to get it for such a good price. We've only just kicked off our homestead, and we've been able to do that because we've passed the biggest barrier, which is getting a property. But the reason we were able to get this property for such a good price is we bought land that everyone else overlooked. The reason that we got this place for as cheap as we got it was this property had some features that made it pretty unappealing to, you know, the average person buying rural land who's looking at land for agricultural purposes or, you know, land investment purposes. And this property had some problems with it from that perspective. I mean, just have a look around. I'm going to tell you about these sandstone gullies in a moment and why they're a huge problem and what we're going to do about it. But it's one of the features of this property that really probably made it quite unappealing to a whole lot of people. But we developed kind of a list of non-negotiables, things that we weren't willing to sacrifice to move out to property. And so they were obvious things like, you know, Kirsty's folks are out here. And, you know, we wanted to think about our later years as well. So we didn't want to be miles and miles and hours away from hospitals and facilities, for example, that kind of thing. There were properties around in the area that if you learned how to use kind of Google Maps and overlay like all the data stuff, that there was coal seam gas mining. And, you know, the more we looked into that, the more we realized, man, that's going to have such an environmental impact. We really don't want to be anywhere near anything like that. So there were some things that were just hard fixed. We're not doing that. Steep, rugged land, like we went up to places where, you know, the landscape was like that, a great price, but even for a homestead. But then there were other things where it was like, you know, if you think outside the box, which is what homesteaders do, right? We look at, you know, how are we going to make this work? How are we going to overcome these challenges? Then there were certain aspects of this property that was like, you know, with a bit of time, a lot of hard work, a bit of money when it becomes available, we could actually turn this thing around. And I am so glad we did when we did, because there's nothing like this available anymore. You've got to go so much further west to get property of this size. We're on 150 acres. We're in the Darling Downs region, which is kind of southern Queensland, Australia. And there's really nothing like this for that budget anymore. So I'm glad we acted when we did. And I don't say that to kind of put you off, because, you know, your 10-year future self is going to look back at decisions that you make today and maybe advice that you get, including maybe from this video, and go, I'm glad I listened to that. I'm glad I acted. I'm glad we just took steps in the direction towards our own homestead dream back then, because, you know, I know a lot of people that are still stuck with just the dream part and never having taken a step towards it. So I want to take you on a walk around the property today, and I'll show you some of the features that we, you know, first probably should have turned us off. We probably should have closed the book on this property and kept looking, but we saw opportunities, we saw hard work, and I'll show you what some of those are. I'm walking along the northern perimeter of the property at the moment, and next to one of these big sandy washouts, and I'll tell you a little bit about how that's happening when we go up into the gullies. But probably one of the biggest turnoffs for most people when looking at this property when it was for sale was just the lack of infrastructure. I mean, even down to fences. Like, the majority of our fences were this: 2 strands of barbed wire, some really old fence posts that have pretty much rotted away to unusability. And then as far as roads go, so yeah, this is supposed to be a road. We call it the Northern Track. Look, if you've got a 4-wheel drive, it's somewhat passable. It's marked on the maps, but it doesn't even have a name. And there's whole sections of it further up here that, you know, that's a little bit muddy and slushy, but there's whole sections of it that just are washed out. The main road, the named road that gets us to our property, well, there's a funny story behind that one, because when we first came out here to even take a look at this property, we looked it up on the map, and there were kind of 2 options for how we could get there. It's about a 3.5 hour drive from where we were living at the time. And, you know, we chose option A because it was the shortest. And we got to this one section where it was, you know, the map said, turn right, that's the start of your road. And there wasn't a road there. There was a fence. There was a gate further up. That was obviously not part of the road. And then we could see these 2 fence lines that would probably be about the width of the road that was marked on the map. And we realized pretty quickly that this was an easement for a future potential road. And there was no driving it. It was, you know, trees were growing up the middle of it. And so we were a little bit sneaky because we looked on the map and it was going to be like another half an hour to go the long way around to find the top northern part of the road and come down to access the property. And so we kind of opened that gate that was right there and snuck up through this paddock. And anyway, we got to the top end of that paddock, and now I know that property is massive. There was no chance that the neighbour was ever going to even see us there. But, you know, we found the gate at the top end and came out and popped out onto the road we were supposed to be on. But all of that to sort of say that, like, even the access to the place, the roads that were marked on the map were kind of sketchy. And, you know, that was our first experience of it. So to, like, the average person looking for a bit of property, they're going to be going, oh man, like, I'm going to get lost half the time trying to find this place. Like, if that's how they mark the roads on the map, how well do they look after them? And I got to tell you, like, our experience over the last few years is not very well. Like, our road frequently gets washed out, and we've got pretty good at doing some self-repairs. So that's one of those things that, you know, people are looking for when they're looking at property, is what are the services and utilities that are connected to it, and how hard is that going to be to work with, and can you overcome those things? I mean, the road situation, we kind of worked it out, and we worked out the main way to get here, but like the track here, it just makes that, you know, top corner of the property inaccessible for us, even through a publicly kind of marked road. The fencing situation, well, this isn't going to be good enough. 2 rusty strands of barbed wire that have fallen down in a bunch of places. I mean, I don't know, can you see this fence line behind me? Like, the posts are just all over the place. It's going to need to be repaired. Now, I'm really fortunate that I've spent some time in the last couple of years, you know, working on land and particularly learning fencing. And look, if you own land and are planning to do livestock and you don't know fencing, then number one, learn how to talk to your neighbours who do know fencing. They're a wealth of information. But watch the Tim Thompson fencing or ag channel, whatever it's called. Tim Thompson is an Aussie guy on YouTube. His fencing tutorials are probably the best I've ever watched, and I've learned most of my fencing techniques from him. But we've got our work cut out for us because our property boundary is 4 kilometres long. Another factor was definitely where this property was positioned in terms of just how far away it was and what services and utilities it was connected to. And the answer to that is nothing. So we're about 3.5 hours away from the coast, and that's where our lives were when we started this journey. But we really fell in love with this place, and some of those issues of distance just kind of resolved themselves, and we got more comfortable with the idea of the utility side of things. That was a whole lot harder, because from the minute you get here, if you don't have, and we don't, running water, sewerage, gas, power, telephone, does anyone even use that anymore? All of those things, you've got to come up with solutions for those. And so we've had to very quickly learn how to build some of those systems ourselves. I mean, the biggest one by far has definitely been our off-grid solar power system, and check out some of our other videos on that. But it was something we had to solve and learn how to do. And I'm not going to lie, I've enjoyed the challenge of learning how to do that. But I guess with all of those things, distance, connection to conveniences, how far away you're going to be from like major metropolitan areas, that was part of how we decided on this place. We don't live in or near a town really. Like, we've got our little locality has a name, but it doesn't even have a crossroads, let alone a post office or a corner store. And yeah, a little bit of a drive, and there is one of those, but really we drive about almost an hour to do kind of our fortnightly shopping and restocking and all of that. And that was part of how we decided on where we would end up. I guess what I'm saying is you've got to work out which of these aspects are in the non-negotiable column and which of them are problems that you're willing to tackle and solve, either through time and experience, learning how to DIY. I mean, if you're into homesteading, DIY is just part of the package. If you write it down, if you work out what you're willing to do, all of a sudden the landscape literally opens up in terms of what becomes available to you to look at. And that's what happened here on this property for us, is we knew, okay, there's nothing connected here, literally nothing, but we're willing to do the work and we're willing to learn. All right, I told you I'd get to these gullies and kind of explain what's happened here, and I'm heading up into one of the deeper ones. I mean, it's kind of obvious what's happened, right? We all learned about the Grand Canyon in grade 2. Water, given enough time and being allowed to travel in the same direction, can cut through anything, even rock. And well, this is just sandstone. The real question is, why has this happened on this property when it hasn't happened on the neighboring properties? And the short answer is sand mining. So this property, probably about 20 years ago, so nearly a decade before we even saw it, it had been allowed to be sand mined. So obviously there's a ton of sand on the property, or there was, and somebody got the contract and the permission to be able to come in and strip all that sand away. Now, the way that process works is obviously a lot of big machinery comes in, sets up. The first thing they would have to do is strip off the topsoil. If you've done any kind of earthworks before, you know that topsoil is just going to get in the way. And if you're concerned about, you know, putting the land back how you found it, and normally this is kind of built into the contract, you'd set that topsoil aside and then put it back. One of two things has happened here. Either they didn't bother with that, and look, we can speculate about that, who knows, or they did, and this is my suspicion, and it didn't really matter because what they'd done to the land meant that within a few short years, whatever topsoil they put back was gone. Landscape has this ability to manage its own water and water issues, and probably the best way that it does that is through vegetation. So a property like this would normally naturally have, you know, grasses and bushes and shrubs, and all of that low down vegetation is going to act like a sieve. And anytime water tries to flow over the land, so if your land's got any kind of slope or gradient to it, this is going to just slow it down. It's going to catch materials. It's going to make sure that not a whole lot of damage can be done. But when you remove all of this, and so I imagine there was a time here where this was completely barren, like down to the sandstone. After they'd scraped off all of that sand and the topsoil, whatever they did with that, it would have been just totally bare. And we get some reasonable rains around here. We had about 4 inches, about 100 mils over a 3-day period last week. And actually I got out and I filmed, because we'd never had the opportunity to get out onto this back part of the property and see what the water does. Obviously we suspected, we knew, you know, just look at these gullies. It's kind of obvious what's happening, but I wanted to see it. So here, I'll share with you some footage of just how that water was behaving. And this is amazing. This is thousands upon thousands of litres of water just travelling across the land at speed. And usually what would be happening is that would be getting soaked into the land because it just wouldn't be allowed to flow that fast or that freely. And so we've got these kind of zones now across the middle of the block where, particularly in these gullies, water can just travel at speed. But one of the other interesting things that's happened is they would have got to a lot of these trees here. I'll turn you around and show you. But there's kind of these humps all over the landscape where you've got bigger trees or bigger groves or stands of trees that obviously they just couldn't be bothered dealing with the root systems. And we call it the Shire because it looks like Hobbiton out there. There's kind of like these little hobbit hills all over the place. And so I imagine they just kind of quick and dirty got in with their dozers and just scraped out as much sand as they could without having to deal with the root systems. But it's left these paths between all of these little hills for water to travel, and where the water's been able to really get like a straight shot, well, that's how we've got these gullies like this. It's been able to really just carve its way through the land. So, you know, we saw this when we got to this property, and it's obviously one of the main reasons people would have rejected it. A good 50, 60 acres of this 150 acres was like this, had been completely stripped. And so when the water's allowed to travel as freely like that across the land as it can, it doesn't just mean you don't catch the water on the land, you also lose all of the resources that are trying to rebuild on the land. So all your topsoil goes, all your vegetation goes, your trees collapse, and it's a real problem. We looked at that and we knew at some point we're going to have to slow the water down, but there was enough on the front 50 acres that we knew we could get started out here. It was enough of reasonable land that we could get started with, but you can't farm land like this. You can't do anything. I can't even get my car past here. We have to walk up the back here. There's not many places that a vehicle can get through, let alone thinking about maybe grazing animals through here. Like, this would be super dangerous. You'd have downed cows all of the time. And so it just makes it impassable, impractical, dangerous. And the two biggest issues are we're losing water that we should be able to catch, that should be, you know, kind of what's regenerating out the land out here. And we're losing materials, we're losing minerals, we're losing topsoil, we're losing vegetation. So that's a problem we've got to solve. And what's really cool is we bought this land, like I said, about 7 years ago, a little bit more, and we've only just moved out here. Kirsty's folks have been here a little bit longer, but as we've kind of been able to get out here and kind of make plans and walk across the land, we've observed it slowly coming back. So nature's doing its thing. And I guess the part that sort of excites us is that we get to be, I guess, custodians of this landscape, to go, you know, the land will heal itself, but we get to play a part in that healing process as well. So we've got some ideas. One of the things we're noticing is that as big trees like this one back here and other big items fall into these gullies, they kind of act like these barriers that start to catch smaller materials and debris, and then, you know, sometimes a big rain will come and reset all of that, but every now and then it just starts to set up this slowing down process. So one of our ideas is to kind of engage with these gullies a little bit like that, and maybe start to create some spots where we can push some material in. There's no way we'll ever fill these. Like, I would have to guess there's 3 or 4 massive gullies like this that are up to about 300 meters long. There'd be thousands of truckloads of material to try and replenish what's missing from these, let alone what's happening on the other surfaces that are contributing to these. So that's just not going to be possible. We have to kind of engage with the natural process to repair it. And so being able to slow the water down is number one. So maybe that's what we'll do in the gullies. And then there are opportunities here for us to get out here with an excavator and just set up a series of berms. And because we've kind of got these little humps and mounds, what we could potentially do is join some of them. And we've noticed when you get out here after a rain, we've already got these little kind of ponds or billabongs forming all over the land. If we can just help that water get to where it needs to get to, where there's natural low spots. And then the other thing we might do is we might put a whole series of berms that, number one, slows the water down as it tries to travel south to north across, that's our biggest flow, where we can just slow it down, but also then redirect it down into the lowest part, which is where our dams already are. And maybe we can add to our overall catchment. But anyway, it's not a massive problem because we're not grazing out here yet, but we want to be, so it's something that we're going to need to solve. So I guess all of that to say that no matter where you are on your homesteading journey, whether you're still in the dream phase, maybe you've been able to get the property, what it's going to come down to, the next step for you is just doing the negotiation. What am I prepared to sacrifice? Where am I prepared to upskill? And just how long am I prepared to kind of put into this? And for us, it's the rest of our lives. I can't think of doing anything else. And so this is it for us. And the challenge ahead, some of the challenges are huge, but we're looking forward to tackling every single one of them.